"Sir, you need to leave. Now." The bouncer's hand pressed firmly against the old man's chest, stopping him at the entrance of the elegant venue. "This is a private military wedding. Invitation only." The elderly veteran in the worn suit looked up at the young security guard, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm here for Captain Morrison. I knew his father." The bouncer's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Right. And I'm here for the Queen of England. Move along before I have you removed." What that bouncer didn't know was that the man he was turning away had once carried the groom's father through 12 miles of hostile territory with a bullet in his own leg. If you believe true heroes deserve respect regardless of how they're dressed, type respect in the comments below. Clint Westwood stood at the entrance of the Grand Pacific Hotel in San Diego, watching well-dressed military officers and their guests stream past him into the wedding reception. At 72 years old, Clint carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd seen combat in 3 different wars and survived them all. His suit was at least 15 years old, pressed carefully but showing its age around the collar and cuffs. His shoes were polished but worn, the leather cracked at the toes. He'd driven 4 hours from his small apartment in Arizona to be here, to see the son of the man he'd served with, to pay his respects on what should be one of the happiest days of the young captain's life. Clint hadn't been invited, not formally. He'd only learned about the wedding by chance when he'd seen the announcement in a military newsletter. But he felt he had to come. 40 years ago, he'd made a promise to a dying man, and Clint Westwood had never broken a promise in his life. The bouncers at the entrance were young, probably in their late 20s, hired security rather than military personnel. They wore black suits and earpieces and carried themselves with the kind of casual authority that came from checking IDs at clubs on Saturday nights. The taller one, Marcus, had already turned away 2 people who'd showed up without proper invitations. He was taking his job seriously, perhaps too seriously. When Clint approached, Marcus sized him up in an instant. Old suit, no invitation visible, slightly stooped posture. He stepped forward before Clint even reached the door. "Can I help you, sir?" The tone was polite but firm, the kind of politeness that was really a warning. Clint smiled gently. "I'm here for the Morrison wedding, Captain Jake Morrison." Marcus exchanged a glance with his partner, Derek, who moved to flank Clint's other side. "Do you have an invitation?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. Clint shook his head slowly. "No, but I served with the groom's father. I wanted to—" Derek cut him off. "Sir, this is a private event. Family and invited guests only. If you don't have an invitation, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Clint's weathered face remained calm, though something flickered in his eyes. "If you could just tell Captain Morrison that Clint Westwood is here, I think he'd—" Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harder edge. "Sir, we're not going to bother the groom on his wedding day because some guy showed up claiming to know his dead father." The words hung in the air like a slap. Clint's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure. "I understand. I just thought—" He reached into his jacket pocket, moving slowly so as not to alarm them, and pulled out a faded photograph protected in a plastic sleeve. "This is me and Lieutenant Morrison, Fallujah, 2004. If you could just—" Derek plucked the photo from Clint's hand and barely glanced at it. "Nice picture. Probably found it online. Sir, I'm not going to ask again. You need to leave, or we'll call the police." Marcus added, "Look, I get it. You want to crash a fancy military wedding, maybe get some free food and drinks. But this isn't happening. Move along." Clint stood there for a moment, the rejection settling over him like a weight. Other guests were starting to notice the commotion, glancing over as they passed. An elderly couple whispered to each other, and a group of young officers in their dress uniforms slowed their pace, watching. Clint felt the familiar ache of being invisible, of having his service and his sacrifice reduced to suspicion and dismissal. He'd felt it before in the years since he'd retired, that sense that the world had moved on and no longer had space for old veterans who didn't fit the image people expected. He started to turn away, his shoulders sagging slightly, when a clear voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" Everyone turned. The bride was standing just inside the entrance, her white dress flowing elegantly around her, her dark hair swept up in an intricate style. Sarah Morrison had stepped away from the receiving line when she'd noticed the disturbance. Her eyes moved from the bouncers to Clint, taking in his worn suit, his dignified posture, the photograph still clutched in Derek's hand. Marcus straightened, suddenly aware that he was dealing with the bride. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the disruption. This gentleman doesn't have an invitation, and we were just escorting him." Sarah held up her hand, cutting him off. She moved closer to Clint, her expression softening. "Sir, I'm Sarah Morrison. Can you tell me why you're here?" Clint met her eyes, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. It was the look of someone who'd seen too much, endured too much, but still carried himself with honor. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, "I served with your husband's father, Lieutenant Thomas Morrison, in Iraq. I was his sergeant. I came to pay my respects to his son. I apologize for causing a scene on your wedding day." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. She'd heard stories about her father-in-law, a man who died before Jake was even born, killed by an IED 3 months after returning from his second deployment. Jake rarely talked about him, the pain of never knowing his father still fresh even 30 years later. "You knew Thomas Morrison?" she asked softly. "Yes, ma'am. I was there when—" Clint's voice caught slightly. "I was there at the end." Sarah's hand went to her throat. She turned to the bouncers, her voice suddenly sharp. "Give me that photograph." Derek handed it over, and she studied it carefully. 2 soldiers, younger versions of themselves, arms around each other's shoulders, smiling despite the dust and exhaustion evident on their faces. One of them looked remarkably like her husband. "Marcus, Derek, go inside and find Captain Morrison immediately. Tell him Clint Westwood is here. Now." The urgency in her voice left no room for argument. The bouncers hurried inside, confusion evident on their faces. Sarah turned back to Clint, and tears were already forming in her eyes. "Mr. Westwood, Jake talks about his father all the time. He has so few people who actually knew him, who can tell him what kind of man Thomas was. This," her voice broke slightly, "this would mean everything to him." Before Clint could respond, rapid footsteps echoed from inside. Captain Jake Morrison burst through the entrance, his dress uniform immaculate, medals gleaming on his chest. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered and commanding, but in that moment he looked like a child searching for something precious. His eyes found Clint, and he stopped dead in his tracks. "Sergeant Westwood?" His voice was barely a whisper. Clint straightened despite his age, his posture shifting into something more military. "Captain Morrison, congratulations on your wedding, son." Jake crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled Clint into a fierce embrace. The guests who'd gathered to watch gasped softly. Sarah wiped at her eyes, her hand finding her new husband's arm when he finally stepped back. Jake's eyes were red. "You're here. You actually came. I tried to find you, to invite you, but I didn't have any contact information, and I thought..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "I found out through a newsletter," Clint said quietly. "I hope it's okay that I came without an invitation. I just wanted to see you, to see the man Thomas's son had become." Jake shook his head, emotion making his voice rough. "Okay? Mr. Westwood, do you have any idea what you mean to our family? My mother told me everything when I was old enough to understand. How my father was hit by shrapnel from that IED, how you carried him for 12 miles through hostile territory, even though you'd been shot in the leg. How you stayed with him, talking to him, keeping him conscious until the medevac arrived. You saved his life that day. He lived another 2 years because of you. 2 years where he got to meet me, to hold me, to tell my mother he loved her one more time. The crowd that had gathered was completely silent now. Several people were crying openly. Marcus and Derek stood off to the side, their faces pale with shame. Clint's own eyes glistened. Your father was a good man, Jake. One of the best soldiers I ever served with. And I promised him that day, if I ever got the chance, I'd check in on his boy. Make sure you turned out all right. He managed a small smile. I'd say you turned out better than all right, Captain. Jake turned to the bouncers, his expression hardening. Marcus, Derek, front and center. The 2 security guards approached, clearly terrified. This man is Sergeant Major Clint Westwood, retired. 3 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, Distinguished Service Cross. He served for 32 years. He saved my father's life and gave me the only 2 years I ever had with him. And you turned him away at the door. Marcus's voice shook. Sir, we didn't know. We thought... Jake cut him off. You thought what? That because he's older? Because his suit isn't brand new? Because he didn't fit your image of what a hero looks like? That he couldn't possibly belong here? You judged a decorated veteran by his appearance and found him lacking. He paused, letting the words sink in. You're both fired. Leave now. Sarah squeezed her husband's arm gently. Jake, she said softly, and there was compassion in her voice even now. Maybe instead of firing them, they can learn something today. About respect, about not judging people by appearances, about understanding that the greatest among us often look the most ordinary. Jake looked at his new wife, then back at Clint, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The captain's expression softened slightly. You're right. He turned back to Marcus and Derek. You keep your jobs, but I want you both to remember this moment. Remember that you turned away a hero because he didn't look like what you expected. Remember that respect isn't something you withhold until someone proves they deserve it. It's something you give freely until someone proves they don't. He gestured to Clint. This man would have given his life for my father. He nearly did. And you treated him like he was trying to scam his way into free champagne. Marcus stepped forward, his voice thick. Sergeant Major Westwood, sir. I'm so sorry. There's no excuse for how we treated you. Derek echoed the sentiment, both men clearly devastated by their mistake. Clint looked at them both with kind eyes. See, you didn't know. But now you do, and that's what matters. Not the mistake, but what you learn from it. He turned back to Jake and Sarah. Now, if you two don't mind, I'd like to toast the happy couple. Though I have to warn you, I'm not much for fancy weddings. Might step on some toes if there's dancing. Jake laughed, the sound breaking through the emotional tension. Mr. Westwood, you're sitting at the head table, right next to my mother. She's been wanting to thank you in person for 40 years. The reception continued, but now with a guest of honor no one had expected. Clint Westwood sat at the head table in his worn but carefully pressed suit, and throughout the evening a steady stream of officers came to shake his hand, to hear his stories, to thank him for his service. Jake's mother, Elizabeth Morrison, held Clint's hand for most of the dinner, tears streaming down her face as he told her stories about her husband that she'd never heard. About his sense of humor, his courage, his love for his family that he'd talked about every single day in the desert. When the speeches began, Jake stood and asked Clint to join him at the microphone. The old veteran protested, but Jake insisted. And finally, Clint rose and stood beside the young captain. Jake's voice carried across the hushed ballroom. Today was supposed to be about Sarah and me starting our life together, and it is. But it's also about the people who made us who we are. The people who sacrificed so we could have moments like this. My father died when I was 2 years old. I have no memories of him, just stories and photographs. But because of Sergeant Major Westwood, I had him for 2 years instead of losing him that day in the desert. Because of the man standing beside me, my father got to hold me, to see me take my first steps, to tell my mother one last time that he loved her. He turned to Clint, his voice breaking. You were almost turned away today. Almost sent home because you didn't have a piece of paper saying you belonged here. But the truth is, you belong here more than almost anyone in this room. Because without you, I wouldn't exist the way I do. My entire life has been shaped by the extra time you gave my father. So thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. And thank you for coming here today, even though you weren't invited. Even though you were treated poorly. Even though you had every reason to turn around and go home. Your presence here is the greatest wedding gift we could have received. The ballroom erupted in applause. Officers stood at attention. Guests wiped tears from their eyes. And Clint Westwood, the old veteran in the worn suit who'd almost been turned away, stood there with tears rolling down his weathered cheeks, finally feeling seen. The story of what happened at Captain Morrison's wedding spread through the military community like wildfire. It became a cautionary tale about judgment and assumptions, about respecting those who've served regardless of how they present themselves. The photograph of Clint sitting at the head table between Jake and Elizabeth Morrison, all three of them smiling through tears, appeared in military publications and was shared thousands of times on social media. But more importantly, it changed things. At military events across the country, new protocols were established. If someone claimed to have served, if someone said they knew the honored guest, security was instructed to verify before dismissing. Respect first, questions second. Clint Westwood went back to his small apartment in Arizona, but his life was different now. He had regular video calls with Jake and Sarah, who'd insisted on giving him their direct numbers. He received invitations to military events, to speaking engagements, to ceremonies honoring veterans. But more than that, he'd reconnected with the family of the man he'd served beside, the man he'd carried through the desert, the man whose final words had been, "Take care of my boy." He'd kept that promise, even if it had taken 40 years to fully fulfill it. Subscribe to my channel if you believe that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized, often dismissed, but never diminished in their worth. Because the measure of our society isn't how we treat the powerful and the prominent, but how we treat the humble and the overlooked. And sometimes the greatest hero in the room is the one nobody notices until it's almost too late.